Take a stroll down Lenox Avenue on any given afternoon, and you'll spot him there. Bumpy Johnson, dressed to perfection, in tailored suits that carry a price tag exceeding what most Harlem households bring in over half a year, emerging from a Cadillac with a shine like polished black stone, moving through the masses that instinctively create a path for him because everybody recognizes exactly who he is and what falls under his command. This is the version of Bumpy Johnson that Harlem witnesses in 1966, rich beyond most people's wildest dreams, influential to the point where politicians come seeking his backing and lawbreakers dread earning his disapproval, refined enough to engage in conversations about books and current affairs with university intellectuals, authoritative enough that a single utterance from his lips can resolve difficulties entirely or, alternatively, demolish someone's means of living. The individual who oversees what's estimated to be a $50 million criminal operation, who provides employment to thousands either directly or through indirect channels via his numbers gambling business, who resides in an upscale apartment that would make white millionaires green with envy, who adorns himself with diamond jewelry and silk neckties and Italian-made leather footwear that costs what his mother once made working for an entire year. However, the Bumpy Johnson that Harlem observes today, this affluent, influential, seemingly invincible crime lord, shares practically nothing in common with the Ellsworth Johnson who stepped into Harlem back in March of 1919 as a 14-year-old boy, living in such extreme poverty that he possessed a single pair of trousers with worn knees, a single shirt that had undergone so many repairs the original material was scarcely recognizable, and footwear with bottoms so deteriorated that he placed cardboard inside just to cover up the openings. That young boy, starving, frantic, filled with fury over wrongs he'd endured but couldn't yet put into words, held within himself the foundation of the man he'd eventually grow into. Yet, nobody observing 14-year-old Ellsworth Johnson's arrival in Harlem alongside his family, transporting all their worldly possessions in 2 beaten-up suitcases, could have possibly anticipated that this malnourished child from South Carolina would rise to become the most dominant black criminal figure in the entire history of America. This is the narrative that remains largely unknown, the narrative Bumpy Johnson keeps to himself, the narrative his inner circle mentions in hushed tones, but seldom discusses openly because the content is too unfiltered, too agonizing, too authentic. This is the narrative of deprivation so severe it influenced every choice Johnson would make over the following 47 years. The narrative of starvation that never truly departed from him, even after acquiring more wealth than he could possibly use. The narrative of degradation and helplessness that formed the groundwork for constructing authority that no one could strip away. For the very first time, Ebony magazine has conducted interviews with individuals who knew Ellsworth Johnson before his transformation into Bumpy Johnson. Friends from his youth in South Carolina, family members who recall the household's dire financial straits, educators who saw his exceptional intelligence and mourned when life circumstances destroyed his academic prospects, and their accounts paint a picture of a childhood so harsh that Johnson's mere survival seems remarkable, let alone his ability to convert that anguish into the driving force that constructed a $50 million enterprise. The initial time I laid eyes on Ellsworth Johnson, he was perhaps 6 years of age, and he was so thin you could tally his ribs just by looking through his clothing. That's what Samuel Matthews remembers, now 67 years old, who was raised 3 homes away from the Johnson household in Charleston's neighborhood designated for colored residents. Every one of the Johnson kids was skinny because that family perpetually lacked sufficient food. However, Ellsworth had it worst because he'd surrender his own portions to his younger brothers and sisters. I can still hear my mama commenting, "That child is going to perish from starvation before reaching 10 years of age." And truthfully, that's what we all believed. We'd witnessed children succumb to malnutrition before. It wasn't an unusual occurrence in our community, and Ellsworth appeared destined to be the next casualty. The Johnson household occupied what kind-hearted folks labeled a shack and what truthful folks called a collapsing death trap just waiting to fall. a wooden construction measuring roughly 16 feet by 20 feet that contained 9 human beings. William and Margaret Johnson, along with their 7 offspring born in the years spanning 1898 through 1912. Ellsworth, who came into the world on October 31st, 1905, was child number 4, positioning him squarely in the middle of all the turmoil. Never the eldest who garnered extra focus. Never the baby who received extra safeguarding, just one among 7 kids fighting for food that never sufficed and parental attention that exhausted mothers and fathers couldn't spare. That dwelling they inhabited wasn't suitable for livestock, Matthews goes on, his voice still bearing pain 6 decades afterward. The structure had openings so large you could peer right through to the outdoors. Rainwater penetrated through the ceiling whenever storms arrived. Heat came exclusively from one tiny stove that couldn't warm beyond a couple feet in any direction. 9 individuals existing in an area that couldn't have measured beyond 320 square feet, resting on the bare floor since beds weren't something they possessed, donning identical garments day in and day out since they lacked enough clothing for rotation. I recall thinking even as a young child that this situation wasn't acceptable, that human beings shouldn't be forced to exist under these conditions. But that represented standard living for colored households experiencing poverty in South Carolina. And the Johnson family lived in desperate poverty. The financial hardship wasn't coincidental or passing. It was built into the system, embedded in every facet of how the economic structure functioned for colored individuals in the South during the early 1900s. William Johnson, Ellsworth's father, earned his living as a dock laborer down in Charleston, performing the sort of punishing manual labor that gradually broke down men's physiques over the years. However, that represented the sole job opportunity available to colored men lacking formal education or particular trade skills. The employment came irregularly and the compensation was offensive. 60 cents for an entire day spent hauling freight, loading vessels, transporting loads heavy enough to cause bodily harm that employers refused to address or provide compensation for. William Johnson, ranked among the most industrious men I've ever encountered, shares Robert Wilson, age 71, who labored side by side with William on those Charleston docks throughout the 1,910 seconds. He'd show up every single morning at 4:30 in the morning, standing there with 40 or 50 additional colored men, hoping the white supervisor would select him for that day's work. On some occasions, he'd receive selection. Other times, he wouldn't. Yet he appeared there each and every morning without exception. And when employment came his way, he labored more intensely than anybody else because fear consumed him at the thought of being replaced, terrified of forfeiting even those 60 cents he might earn when opportunities presented themselves. But you want to know what the real tragedy was? William had the capacity to work 6 complete days moving cargo that would break most men. And when the week concluded, he'd possess $3.60 to account for his efforts. $3.60 for sustaining a household of 9 individuals. It's an impossibility. The mathematics simply don't work. You cannot provide nourishment for 9 people on $3.60 weekly. Consequently, the Johnson family experienced constant hunger, perpetually fell behind on their housing payments, perpetually stood one emergency away from total catastrophe. Margaret Johnson, Ellsworth's mother, exerted herself even harder than her spouse, though the word worked fails to fully capture her activities. Margaret toiled, there exists no alternative description, as a household servant for affluent white families throughout Charleston, maintaining the cleanliness of their residences, preparing their daily meals, raising their offspring, performing the intimate labor of sustaining white families' comfortable existences, all while her own children remained at home unattended, essentially raising themselves since she was occupied raising white children and had no time remaining for her biological kids. Miss Margaret provided services for my aunt's household when I was a young girl, shares Eleanor Harrison, 69 years old, a white Charleston resident who consented to speak with Ebony under the condition her aunt's family remain anonymous. I can recall my aunt discussing her, speaking about her exceptional cleaning abilities, her wonderful interactions with the children, her dependability and strong work ethic. And I remember my aunt compensated her $2.50 weekly for 6 days of labor, 12 hours daily. My aunt considered herself generous since certain families provided only $2 weekly. I was maybe 10 years of age. And even at that young age, I grasped there was something fundamentally wrong about compensating someone $2.50 for 72 hours of labor, but that simply represented standard wages for colored domestic workers, and nobody raised objections. Now I'm approaching 70 years of age, and Miss Margaret enters my thoughts occasionally. I think about how she was nurturing my aunt's children because my aunt was preoccupied with her social gatherings and her shopping excursions to tend to her own children, and simultaneously, Miss Margaret's children sat at home alone because financial necessity prevented her from staying home with them. The unfairness of it still turns my stomach even now. Combining William's dock labor with Margaret's domestic service work, the Johnson family's complete household earnings averaged somewhere around $12 to $15 monthly throughout Ellsworth's formative years. Roughly $3 to $3.50 each week for a 9-person family. From that impossible sum, approximately $3 went toward rent for the deteriorating shacks surrounding them. Approximately $8 to $10 went toward purchasing food when food purchases were feasible, and whatever money remained, typically $1 to $2, needed to cover absolutely everything else. Clothing for 7 children continuously growing, firewood for cooking purposes and warmth, medicine whenever illness struck, the never-ending minor costs that poverty doesn't eliminate but renders impossible to meet. Sufficiency never existed, says Sarah Johnson Williams, 64 years old, Ellsworth's younger sister, who continues residing in Harlem. Never sufficient food, never sufficient money, never sufficient anything whatsoever. I recall being 8 years old and questioning Mama about why we couldn't consume breakfast the way other kids did. And she wept. Just began weeping right there in my presence. She responded, "Baby, we consume what our finances allow, and our finances allow 1 meal daily if fortune smiles on us. 1 meal daily for 7 developing children. I experienced hunger every single day throughout my childhood until our relocation to New York, every single day without exception. Your belly aches when hunger reaches that severity. Were you aware of that? It creates genuine physical discomfort, and concentration becomes impossible. Can't focus on anything beyond your hunger. Can't achieve sleep sometimes because the hunger disrupts your rest. The hunger Ellsworth experienced during childhood wasn't the temporary hunger that comes from skipping 1 meal or delaying dinner. It was relentless, grinding, unceasing hunger that molded both his physical growth and his psychological development in manners that would impact him throughout his remaining years. Medical professionals who provided commentary to Ebony explained that children enduring severe malnutrition during crucial developmental periods frequently suffer lasting consequences: restricted growth, mental impairments, compromised immune function, psychological damage that emerges as anxiety surrounding food availability that continues even when food becomes plentiful in later years. Childhood starvation fundamentally rewires the brain, explains Dr. James Mitchell, a medical doctor who concentrates on nutrition and child development. Children raised experiencing chronic hunger develop what we term scarcity mentality. Their neural pathways are literally molded by the reality of insufficient resources, which impacts their thinking about resources, safety, and survival throughout their entire existence. Numerous individuals who went through severe childhood hunger report that even many decades afterward, even after achieving wealth and gaining access to unlimited food, they cannot eliminate the anxiety about food supplies running out, cannot stop contemplating where their subsequent meal will originate, cannot fully appreciate eating because portions of their consciousness remain constantly calculating whether adequate supplies will exist. It represents a trauma form that doesn't heal simply because external circumstances improve. Ellsworth Johnson's adult relationship with food, as described by individuals who've shared dining experiences with him, carries all the characteristic signs of someone who endured severe childhood hunger. Bumpy consistently finishes every morsel on his plate, shares William "Bub" Hewlett, who served as Johnson's bodyguard and trusted associate for over 2 decades. Makes no difference if he's already full. Makes no difference if he's dining at an expensive establishment where additional food orders remain available. He consumes every single bite, and visible discomfort emerges when other people abandon food on their plates. I've observed him at business dinners where white businessmen order costly steaks and subsequently consume only half their portions. And you can observe Bumpy growing tense, growing almost angry, as though it constitutes a personal insult that these wealthy individuals are squandering food. On one occasion, he actually confronted a man who'd abandoned most of his dinner untouched. He said, "You planning to finish that, or are you simply ordering food for wasteful purposes?" The man appeared shocked, but Bumpy wasn't making jokes. He genuinely cannot tolerate witnessing food waste. The scarcity mentality reached beyond just food into every dimension of how Johnson accumulated and administered wealth. Bumpy preserves everything, shares Theodore "Teddy" Green, Johnson's legal counsel and financial advisor. He possesses $50 million in worth, yet he continues saving rubber bands, continues reusing envelopes, continues maintaining meticulous records of every penny he expends. I've attempted explaining he doesn't require such carefulness anymore, that his wealth exceeds what he could spend across 3 lifetimes, but he cannot alter these patterns. Growing up possessing nothing instills habits that don't vanish simply because wealth arrives. He's enjoyed wealth for 30 years, yet portions of him remain that hungry South Carolina child ensuring nothing gets wasted because waste meant his family might face starvation tomorrow. What renders Ellsworth Johnson's childhood poverty even more heartbreaking is how it demolished educational possibilities that might have permitted him to escape poverty through lawful channels rather than through criminal activities. Multiple sources familiar with young Ellsworth describe a child possessing extraordinary intelligence, who absorbed knowledge faster than his peers, who demonstrated analytical abilities that deserved cultivation through advanced schooling, but that instead went to waste because schools serving colored children in South Carolina barely operated. Ellsworth Johnson was the most intelligent child I taught across 30 years in education, shares Dorothy Hampton, 78 years old, who served as the instructor at the colored school. Ellsworth attended sporadically between ages 7 and 11. He mastered reading within weeks when most children required months. He could perform arithmetic mentally that children double his age couldn't complete on paper. He posed questions demonstrating he was contemplating what he learned in ways that transcended simple memorization. He wanted comprehension of how mechanisms functioned, why circumstances existed as they did, how different knowledge pieces connected together. I informed his mother that Ellsworth possessed potential to become something remarkable if proper education became accessible, if he could attend a genuine school with qualified instructors and sufficient materials and advancement opportunities. However, the school Ellsworth attended, the sole educational facility available to colored children in his Charleston community, represented the opposite of what a child possessing his intelligence required. A solitary room accommodating approximately 60 children spanning ages 5 through 14. Taught by one instructor who herself had only finished 8th grade, possessing no books except several tattered textbooks that were multiple decades old and had been discarded by white schools upon receiving new materials, possessing no paper or pencils except what children brought from their residences, possessing no warmth during winter except what one small wood stove provided when the school could afford firewood. That school constituted an insult, Hampton continues, her voice still conveying anger 6 decades afterward. The white schools throughout Charleston possessed multiple classrooms, possessed qualified teachers holding college degrees, possessed new textbooks and supplies and laboratories and libraries. The colored school possessed me, one woman holding an 8th grade education, attempting to teach 60 children of varying ages, all within one room, and we possessed maybe 10 books total, in such deteriorated condition they were scarcely readable. How does a brilliant child develop under those conditions? How does anyone learn when the educational system's very structure is intentionally designed to guarantee colored children receive minimal possible education so they can barely read and write but cannot develop skills required for professional careers? The inadequacy of education available to Ellsworth was intensified by the reality that even if he'd received excellent education, virtually no opportunities existed for educated colored individuals in South Carolina throughout the 1,910 seconds. Colored attorneys couldn't practice in most courtrooms, colored physicians couldn't provide treatment to white patients, and struggled earning livings serving exclusively colored communities too impoverished to pay adequate medical fees. Colored teachers earned fractions of white teachers' salaries and worked in schools possessing no resources. The small number of colored individuals who did manage obtaining advanced education frequently departed the South entirely because opportunities to utilize their education didn't exist in locations where white supremacy was so absolute. I informed Ellsworth's mother that his intelligence would go to waste, Hampton says quietly. I told her that even if he remained in school, even if he somehow gained access to superior education, the world wasn't going to provide opportunities matching his capabilities, because the world didn't care about colored children's intelligence levels. I've reflected on that conversation countless times across the years. I crushed that mother's hopes because I believed I was being realistic, believed I was preparing her for the truth that her brilliant son wasn't going to experience the life his intelligence should have provided. And my assessment was correct. Ellsworth didn't become a physician or attorney or professor, but I was simultaneously wrong because I never envisioned he'd become what he became. I never envisioned that the intelligence I observed in that 11-year-old would be applied toward constructing a criminal empire rather than being applied toward legitimate professions. Portions of me wonder what Ellsworth Johnson could have achieved if he'd been born white, or born 20 years afterward, or born in a location where brilliant black children received opportunities rather than being informed their brilliance didn't matter. Ellsworth ceased attending school permanently upon reaching 11 years of age, simply stopped going one day and never returned despite his mother's pleading, despite his teacher visiting their shack attempting to convince him to continue. I questioned Ellsworth about why he wouldn't return to school, Hampton recalls. He looked at me with eyes that seemed too aged for an 11-year-old child, and he stated, "Miss Hampton, what's the purpose? You informed my mama I possess intelligence, but that it's irrelevant because no white person is going to offer me employment requiring intelligence. So, why should I waste time learning things that won't help my family eat? I can work and earn money rather than sitting in school learning how to read books we don't possess about things that don't matter." I didn't possess an answer for him. He was correct. That was the tragedy. This brilliant child was making a rational choice based on accurate evaluation of his circumstances, and his rational choice was abandoning education because education was useless for colored children in South Carolina. What shaped Ellsworth Johnson more than the hunger or the poverty or the destroyed educational possibilities was the rage, the burning, constant, all-consuming anger at the injustice of everything he experienced, at the disparity between how intensely his parents labored and how poor they remained, at the casual cruelty of white individuals who profited from black labor while treating black people as subhuman, at the waste of his own intelligence because society had no use for intelligent colored children, at the complete system that seemed intentionally designed to guarantee colored people remained powerless and poor, regardless of their efforts or their capabilities. Ellsworth was angry constantly when we were children, remembers Samuel Matthews, the childhood friend who thought Ellsworth would die before age 10. Not loud, angry, not fighting angry. He wasn't engaging in fights with other children or causing disturbances. But you could observe it in his eyes, in how he carried himself, in how he discussed white people and the world. He was furious at the injustice of everything. His father labored harder than any man I ever witnessed and couldn't feed his family. His mother was exhausted constantly from working 2 jobs, and still they were poor. Ellsworth was smarter than any child in our community but couldn't attend a real school. And he comprehended, even as a child, he comprehended that this wasn't random misfortune or his family's fault. This was systematic, intentional, designed to keep colored people down regardless of their actions. The rage crystallized around particular incidents that Ellsworth witnessed and that remained with him for decades. I recall when Ellsworth was maybe 9 years old, says Sarah Johnson Williams, his younger sister. Our mother arrived home from work weeping so intensely she could barely speak. The white woman she worked for had accused her of theft, claimed Mama had taken food that the woman had actually instructed Mama to discard, but had subsequently forgotten giving that instruction. The woman threatened calling the police and having Mama arrested unless Mama apologized and accepted reduced wages as punishment for the theft. Mama apologized for something she hadn't done and accepted being paid even less than the almost nothing she was already earning because losing that job meant we'd starve. Ellsworth watched our mother cry from the humiliation of it, and I observed something shift in his face. He didn't cry. He just became very quiet and very cold. And he stated, "When I grow up, nobody's ever going to be able to do that to me. Nobody's ever going to have power over me like that white woman has power over Mama." He was 9 years old, and he was already deciding that accumulating power was the sole way to avoid the kind of powerlessness our mother experienced. Another formative incident occurred when Ellsworth was approximately 12 years old and watched his father return home from the docks with his hand crushed following a loading accident. The white supervisors had ordered colored workers to lift cargo that was too heavy to lift safely. And when William's hand was crushed in the accident, the supervisor blamed William for being careless, refused to pay for medical treatment, told William he could either return to work with his crushed hand or lose his job. My father wrapped his hand in rags and returned to work the following day. Sarah remembers. His hand was probably broken, but he never received treatment because we couldn't afford a doctor and his employer wouldn't pay for treatment. That hand healed incorrectly and caused him pain throughout the rest of his life. Reduced his ability to perform physical labor, probably shortened his working life by years. And Ellsworth watched all of that unfold. Watched his father injured because white supervisors cared more about moving cargo quickly than about colored workers' safety. Watched his father have to return to work injured because we needed the money. Watched his father's hand heal wrong because we couldn't afford proper medical care. I believe that was when Ellsworth decided that poverty was intolerable, that being powerless was intolerable, that he'd rather die than live the kind of life our parents were living. The rage Ellsworth felt wasn't just personal. It was political, structural, understanding that what his family experienced was part of a larger system of oppression affecting all colored people. Ellsworth discussed race and injustice in ways most children didn't. Remembers Robert Wilson, who knew the family from church. Most of us children simply accepted that this was how things were. White people were rich and colored people were poor. White people had power and colored people didn't. That was just the natural order of things. But Ellsworth questioned it constantly. He'd ask why white children attended schools with books while colored children attended schools with nothing. He'd ask why his mother labored harder than any white woman but earned less in a week than white women spent on a single dress. He'd ask why his father's life was worth less than white men's lives. Why his father's injury didn't matter to the people who caused it. And he wasn't just asking questions. He was angry about the answers. Angry that the world was designed this way, determined that somehow he'd find a way to escape the fate that white supremacy had designed for colored people. When the Johnson family decided to leave South Carolina and join the Great Migration to New York in 1919, they were making a decision that millions of black families made during that era, a desperate attempt to escape the brutal poverty and racism of the South in search of better opportunities in northern cities. But for 14-year-old Ellsworth, the migration wasn't just about finding better opportunities. It was about escaping a place that had tried to destroy him and finding a place where the intelligence and the determination and the rage that had been building inside him for 14 years could finally be channeled toward building the power and wealth he had decided were the only protections against the kind of powerlessness and poverty that had defined his childhood. I recall when Mama informed us we were moving to New York, Sarah recalls. All of us children were excited except Ellsworth. We were thinking about the train ride, about seeing a big city, about going somewhere new. But Ellsworth's reaction was different. He stated, "We're leaving this place and we're never coming back. I'm never going to be poor again. I'm never going to be powerless again. Whatever it takes, I'm going to build something in New York that means I never have to live like this again." He was 14 years old, and he was already making a vow that he'd spend the next 47 years keeping. The journey from Charleston to New York took 3 days, with the Johnson family riding in the colored section of the train, carrying everything they owned in 2 battered suitcases and 1 wooden crate. They arrived at Penn Station on March 18th, 1919, with exactly $3 remaining from the money they'd saved for the trip, with no connections except William's cousin, who'd moved to Harlem 2 years earlier, with no plan except to find work and hope that New York offered the opportunities they'd heard about. I asked Ellsworth years later what he remembered about arriving in New York, says Theodore Green, his attorney. He said he remembered stepping off that train and looking around at Penn Station, at the size of it, at the crowds, at the obvious wealth and power represented by that building, and making a decision. He decided that he was going to have some of that wealth and power, that he wasn't going to be the poor colored boy from South Carolina anymore, that whatever it took, he'd become someone who had money and influence and the kind of power that meant nobody could humiliate him or his family the way they'd been humiliated in the South. He was 14 years old. Most 14-year-olds are thinking about school and friends and maybe girls. Ellsworth was thinking about how to accumulate enough power that he'd never be powerless again. What Ellsworth discovered in Harlem was both opportunity and more injustice. Opportunity because New York offered paths to wealth that hadn't existed in South Carolina. The policy gambling operations that Harlem residents played religiously, the informal economy of hustles and schemes and criminal enterprises that existed alongside legitimate work, the possibility that intelligence and ruthlessness could be converted into money and influence if someone was smart enough and determined enough and willing to take risks, but also more injustice because Northern racism, while less overtly violent than Southern racism, still kept colored people in subordinate positions, still paid them less than white workers, still restricted where they could live and what opportunities they could access. Ellsworth was brilliant at understanding systems, says Stephanie Street. Claire, the queen of policy, who was one of Harlem's most successful numbers operators and who became Ellsworth's mentor when he was a teenager. When he started working for me in 1920, he was 15 years old. Even then, I could see immediately that this wasn't a normal street kid looking for quick money. This was someone who understood how power worked, how money worked, how systems worked. He'd ask me questions about how I organized my operations, how I protected myself from police, how I dealt with competitors. He was learning constantly, analyzing everything, figuring out not just how to do what I did, but how to do it better. And the motivation wasn't greed, at least not normal greed. The motivation was this absolute determination never to be poor again, never to be powerless again, never to experience the kind of hunger and humiliation he'd experienced as a child. Over the next decade, from age 15 when he started working for Street, Claire to age 25 when he'd established his own independent policy operations, Ellsworth Johnson transformed himself from a poor immigrant from South Carolina into one of Harlem's most successful criminals. He learned the policy business from Street Claire, learned how to organize runners and collectors, learned how to calculate odds and manage money, learned how to deal with police and politicians who demanded bribes. He built a reputation for intelligence and reliability, for being someone who kept his word and who solved problems efficiently. And he accumulated money, first hundreds of dollars, then thousands, then tens of thousands. Money that represented not just wealth, but security, power, the ability to never be hungry again, the ability to protect himself and his family from the kind of poverty that had nearly destroyed them. The first time Ellsworth gave money to our mother, Sarah remembers, he was maybe 18 years old and he handed her $100. $100. More money than our mother had ever held at one time in her entire life. Mama started crying and tried to refuse it. Said she didn't want money from criminal activities. Didn't want her son risking himself doing illegal things. And Ellsworth said something I'll never forget. He said, "Mama, you worked yourself nearly to death for 20 years for white people who paid you almost nothing and treated you like you were worthless. Now I'm making more in a week than you made in a year, and I'm giving it to you because you deserve to have some comfort after everything you sacrificed. Take the money, buy food, buy warm clothes, maybe stop working so hard because your son can support you now." Mama took the money, and from that day forward until she died in 1954, Ellsworth made sure our mother never had to work again, made sure she lived in a nice apartment, made sure she had everything she needed. The money was illegal, but the love behind it was real. Today, in 1966, Bumpy Johnson controls an estimated $50 million in assets, cash, real estate, business interests, both legitimate and criminal, investments in various enterprises throughout New York. The exact figure is impossible to verify because Johnson's wealth is deliberately hidden through complex corporate structures and offshore accounts. But financial experts who've studied his operations estimate his net worth is somewhere between $45 million and $60 million, making him one of the wealthiest black men in America and certainly the wealthiest black criminal in American history. Bumpy's wealth is structured very deliberately, explains Theodore Green. He owns apartment buildings throughout Harlem that generate rental income. He owns legitimate businesses, restaurants, nightclubs, taxi companies that provide legal income and employment for hundreds of people. He has investments in stocks and bonds managed through accounts that can't be traced back to him directly, and then he has the policy gambling operations that generate millions per year in revenue. When you add it all together, his net worth is probably $50 million, maybe more. For context, that's equivalent to what some Fortune 500 company executives are worth. A poor boy from South Carolina who left school at age 11 is as wealthy as corporate presidents who went to Harvard. The wealth manifests in visible and invisible ways. Visibly, Johnson lives in a luxury apartment on Sugar Hill, one of Harlem's most prestigious addresses. He wears custom suits from an Italian tailor that cost $800 each. He drives a new Cadillac every year. He dines at the best restaurants, travels internationally, collects art and rare books. But the invisible manifestations of wealth might be more significant. The security of knowing he could stop working today and live comfortably for the rest of his life. The power to help family members and friends financially, the ability to influence politics through contributions and connections, the respect that comes from being wealthy in a society that measures value in dollars. But here's what people don't understand about Bumpy's wealth, says William Hewlett. The money isn't just about having nice things. The money is about power and security and never being vulnerable the way he was vulnerable as a child. Bumpy could live in a mansion in Westchester if he wanted to. He can afford it, but he chooses to live in Harlem, chooses to be visible in his community, chooses to use his wealth in ways that help other people who are struggling the way his family struggled. He remembers what it's like to be hungry. He remembers what it's like to watch your parents work themselves to exhaustion for almost nothing, and that memory drives everything he does with his money. Johnson's charitable activities, largely unreported by mainstream press but well known in Harlem, include annual Thanksgiving turkey distributions that feed thousands of families, regular financial support to churches and community organizations, informal assistance to individuals who need help with medical bills or rent or other emergencies. Bumpy gives away probably $200,000 to $300,000 per year to help Harlem residents. Estimates Green, sometimes it's organized charity like the Thanksgiving turkeys. Sometimes it's individual assistance. Someone comes to him saying they're about to be evicted and he pays their back rent. Sometimes it's supporting community institutions like funding youth programs or helping churches repair their buildings. He doesn't publicize it because he's not doing it for recognition. He's doing it because he remembers being the person who needed help, remembers what it's like when there's no safety net and no help available. Despite 47 years of distance from the poverty of his childhood, despite wealth beyond anything he could have imagined as a starving child in South Carolina, despite power and influence and success that should have erased the trauma of those early years, Bumpy Johnson remains shaped by the hunger and the powerlessness and the rage that defined the first 14 years of his life. You can see it in how Bumpy operates, says Stephanie Street Clare. He's been wealthy for decades, but he's never wasteful, never careless with money, never takes security for granted. He still thinks like someone who's one crisis away from poverty, even though he's one of the richest men in Harlem. That comes from growing up with nothing. Once you've experienced real hunger, once you've watched your parents work themselves to exhaustion and still not have enough, once you've felt that kind of powerlessness, it doesn't leave you. It stays with you forever, shapes every decision you make, drives you to keep accumulating power and wealth even when you have more than enough. Because somewhere deep inside, you're still that hungry child, terrified of going back to having nothing. The trauma manifests in unexpected ways. Bumpy cannot stand seeing children go hungry, says Sarah Johnson Williams. If he sees a child who looks underfed or who he learns isn't eating properly, he has to do something about it immediately. I've seen him give mothers money to buy food for their children. I've seen him arrange for families to receive regular deliveries of groceries. One time he learned that a school in Harlem had children coming to class without breakfast. And within a week, he'd arranged for a church to provide free breakfast to those children every morning. It's not just charity, it's personal. Those hungry children are him 60 years ago, and he can't bear seeing them suffer the way he suffered. Friends and associates report that Johnson sometimes has nightmares about his childhood, dreams where he's back in South Carolina, hungry and powerless. Dreams where his wealth disappears and he's poor again. He told me once that he still sometimes wakes up frightened, says Theodore Green, frightened that everything he's built will disappear somehow, that he'll end up back where he started. Intellectually, he knows that's not going to happen. He's diversified his assets, protected himself financially, built security that can't be easily destroyed, but emotionally, the fear of losing everything and being poor again never completely leaves him. That's the legacy of childhood poverty. It scars you in ways that don't heal just because circumstances improve. The question that haunts everyone who knows Bumpy Johnson's full story is what he could have become if he'd been born in different circumstances. If his intelligence and determination had been channeled toward legitimate pursuits instead of toward crime, if society had provided opportunities for brilliant black children instead of deliberately destroying those opportunities through segregation and discrimination. I think about this all the time, says Dorothy Hampton, the teacher who recognized Ellsworth's brilliance when he was a child. What could that brilliant mind have accomplished if he'd had proper education? If he'd been able to go to college, to graduate school, to pursue whatever field interested him, he could have been a doctor, a lawyer, a professor, a scientist. He had the intelligence to become anything he wanted to become. But society didn't give him those opportunities. Didn't care that he was brilliant. Only cared that he was colored and that colored people were supposed to remain in subordinate positions. So instead of becoming a doctor, he became a criminal. Instead of using his intelligence to cure diseases or advance knowledge, he used it to build a gambling empire. And you know what the tragedy is? He's brilliant at what he does. He's built a $50 million fortune through intelligence and strategic thinking. Imagine what he could have accomplished if that same intelligence had been applied to legitimate fields where he could have benefited society instead of operating outside the law. But others argue that this question misses something important about Johnson's choices and about the limited options available to black men of his generation. People ask what Bumpy could have been if he'd had different opportunities, says Street Clare. But that question assumes legitimate opportunities existed for black men with his intelligence, and they didn't. Even college-educated black men in the 1,920 and 1,930 seconds faced discrimination that limited their options. Black doctors couldn't treat white patients. Black lawyers couldn't practice in most courts. Black professionals earned fractions of what white professionals earned. So even if Bumpy had somehow gotten education, even if he'd become a doctor or lawyer, he still would have faced barriers and discrimination and limits on what he could achieve. At least in the criminal world, his race was less important than his intelligence and his capability. At least building a criminal empire allowed him to accumulate wealth and power that exceeded what he could have accumulated in any legitimate profession available to black men. The tragedy isn't that he became a criminal. The tragedy is that crime offered him more opportunities than legitimate society did. And there's another dimension to the question of what Johnson could have been. Whether his specific experiences of poverty and injustice created capabilities that might not have developed if he'd grown up in more comfortable circumstances. Bumpy's childhood made him who he is, argues Theodore Green. The hunger taught him to be ruthless about protecting resources. The poverty taught him to plan long-term and think strategically about accumulating wealth. The injustice taught him to understand power and how systems work and how to manipulate those systems. Would he have developed those same capabilities if he'd grown up wealthy and comfortable? Maybe not. Maybe the brutal poverty and the trauma were necessary to create the drive and the determination and the strategic intelligence that made him successful. I'm not saying poverty is good. It's not. It's terrible. It destroys most people who experience it. But for the few people who survive it and who channel the trauma into productive energy, that suffering can become fuel that drives extraordinary achievement. Bumpy is one of those rare people who took the worst possible circumstances and transformed them into the foundation for building something extraordinary. Today, when Bumpy Johnson walks down Lenox Avenue in his $800 suit, wearing his diamond rings and his Italian shoes, when he steps out of his Cadillac that costs more than most Harlem families earn in 5 years, when he conducts business that involves moving millions of dollars with a phone call, he's the living embodiment of a transformation so complete that it's almost impossible to reconcile the wealthy, powerful man of 1966 with the starving child of 1905 to 1919. But everyone who knows Johnson's full story understands that the starving child never completely disappeared. That somewhere inside the wealthy criminal emperor is still that hungry boy from South Carolina who watched his parents work themselves to exhaustion for almost nothing, who left school at 11 because education seemed useless, who experienced powerlessness so total that he dedicated his life to ensuring he'd never be powerless again. The hunger that shaped his childhood continues to shape his adulthood, continues to drive decisions and motivate actions and influence how he thinks about wealth and power and security. From a shack in South Carolina to a luxury apartment in Harlem, from eating once per day to dining at the finest restaurants, from watching his mother humiliated by white employers to commanding respect from politicians and criminals and businessmen, from complete powerlessness to controlling a $50 million empire, from nothing to everything. That's the journey Bumpy Johnson made. And every dollar of the $50 million, every piece of territory he controls, every victory he's achieved over the past 47 years is built on the foundation of childhood poverty so brutal that it should have destroyed him. But that instead became the fuel that powered one of the most extraordinary transformations in American history. The boy who had nothing became the man who has everything. And he's never forgotten where he came from, never forgotten what hunger feels like, never forgotten the rage at injustice that turned a starving child into a criminal emperor worth $50 million.